Here's everything you need to know about the Idaho murders from a former federal prosecutor. I'm Neama Rahmani, and I've put more than 1,000 people in prison, including murderers, and I've worked with FBI agents on complex investigations like this. Let's start with the charges. Bryan Kohberger has been charged with 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and 1 count of burglary. First-degree murder is important because that allows Idaho prosecutors to ask for the death penalty. And if you believe in the death penalty, this is a death penalty case. The death penalty is important because I don't think prosecutors will be able to offer Kohberger any type of deal. This is one of the most gruesome murders in Idaho state history, and the premeditated nature of it leads me to believe that this will likely be a capital case. On the other hand, I don't expect Kohberger to take any type of deal for reasons that I'll explain. The burglary count is still important though. Why? When it doesn't add to his sentence, but it allows prosecutors to argue that Kohberger entered the house unlawfully. And this is important because the defense is going to argue that this was a party house and Kohberger's DNA could have been transferred to the house because there were so many people coming and going. So how he entered the house is important. And burglary, of course, is the unlawful entry of a dwelling, commercial or residential, with the intent to commit a felony inside. Kohberger's arrest and extradition from Pennsylvania to Idaho are important as well. In every state, flight can be introduced as evidence of guilt. Of course, the defense is going to argue that Kohberger was just driving back home during winter break with his dad. The prosecution will say that he was trying to flee and cover his tracks. The reason Kohberger waived extradition and agreed to come back to Idaho is extradition is, generally speaking, within the United States, an issue of identity. You can't really challenge the sufficiency of the search warrant or the arrest warrant in Pennsylvania. As long as you're the individual named in the warrant, states have to honor valid arrest warrants issued by other states. This is the full faith and credit provision of the U.S. Constitution. Let's talk about some of the key pieces of evidence against Kohberger and how strong they are. First, his DNA was at the scene, and specifically, it was in a knife sheath. Now, the reason we know his DNA was at the scene was not because of Kohberger himself, was because law enforcement got his father's DNA out of his trash at his family home in Pennsylvania, and they were able to do a familial match, saying it was 99.9% related to the DNA they found at the scene. The problem is, from a prosecution perspective, given how bloody the crime scene was, you would expect there to be more DNA. And we're probably also going to hear defense evidence that there was DNA from a lot of other individuals there. Again, there was a lot of coming and going from this house reportedly, and a lot of individuals lived there. So DNA is going to be one of the biggest issues with respect to expert testimony in this case. Next, we have the roommate identification, which is unclear at best. The roommate did say that she encountered the suspect and described him as approximately 5'10", muscular with bushy eyebrows, but I'm not certain the roommate is going to be able to identify Kohberger in court, and I'm unsure how helpful that identification will be at trial. The next key piece of evidence is the white Hyundai Elantra, which is registered to Bryan Kohberger, of course. And we know this is key because law enforcement asked for the public's help in identifying this vehicle for weeks before Kohberger's arrest. Unfortunately, the video surveillance of the vehicle on the night of the murders didn't catch a license plate. So we don't have definitive evidence that Kohberger's vehicle was the one that was present on the night of the murders. Probably the most important evidence everyone's talking about, and what really takes up most of the search warrant, is the cell site evidence. Now, if you don't know, cell phone technology pings off towers and allows law enforcement to identify where that cell phone is, sometimes within a few feet. Importantly, on the night of the murders, there was a significant gap of hours where Kohberger's cell phone did not ping off any towers, much less of towers near the scene of the murders. Now, law enforcement is arguing that because Kohberger was sophisticated, he's a PhD student in criminal justice, he knew about this technology and he intentionally turned his phone off or put it in airplane mode so it wouldn't hit cell phone towers. But there is evidence of Kohberger's cell phone traveling from Washington State to Idaho before it stops hitting towers. And it's off for several hours, then it picks back up again and travels from Idaho to Washington. Now, this is important because it shows that the phone was moving in the late hours, and also importantly, it was near bodies of water. We don't have a murder weapon here. We know that these victims were stabbed many times, and law enforcement probably thinks that Kohberger discarded that knife by throwing it into one of those bodies of water along his path home. Some other potentially identifying evidence are the vans that were reportedly worn by the killer. Problem is, we don't have a shoe size yet, and vans are worn by a lot of college students, including maybe one of the roommates who lived at the house. Motive is not an element of the crime, and prosecutors do not have to prove motive to get a guilty verdict. But practically speaking, jurors are going to ask why someone would kill 4 innocent people in cold blood. So the state is going to have to provide some sort of explanation. Now, there's been a lot reported on social media about Kohberger's past, his upbringing, some of his reportedly antisocial behavior. But I think the state is going to need to tell some sort of story, an opening statement as to why anyone would do this. Kohberger was very careful to cover up his tracks. We've talked about the cell phone already, but even when it came to fingerprints, he reportedly wore gloves when he would go to the grocery store. So this is someone that is much more sophisticated than your typical defendant who's charged with murder and may have been able to successfully cover his tracks if law enforcement and prosecutors can't get more evidence putting him at the scene of the murders. Now, the state may argue that Kohberger was stalking the victims and his cell phone was pinging near their home before the murders and the morning of the murders, at least a dozen times. I think law enforcement will want to have some sort of connection, either DMs, text messages, phone calls, something more than his mere presence around the house before they were killed. Here's how we're going to get more information before trial. The affidavits in support of the search warrants have been unsealed now that Kohberger's been arrested and brought to Idaho. But the parties are under a gag order, and this means that law enforcement and prosecutors can't talk about the evidence in the case aside from what's been filed in court. And this was a request by the defense to avoid additional publicity in the case, because let's be real, everyone in the country has heard about the Idaho murders, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on these jurors to return a guilty verdict. The reason I'm talking about jurors is I believe this case is going to go to trial. The prosecution shouldn't offer any type of deal, and I don't expect Kohberger to take one. This was a cold, calculated, ruthless killing. I believe there's only one murderer involved, and if it was Kohberger, given his education, given all the steps he took to cover his tracks, I don't think he's going to take anything, even if it's a life sentence in Idaho State Prison, because he believes he can get away with it. I'm going to continue to cover this case on TV and traditional and social media, so make sure to like, follow, subscribe, hit the bell for updates, and follow us on all social media channels at West Coast Trial Lawyers.